Hi, my name is Steve Myers. This presentation is about the existential threats that face humanity and whether Jung's theory has a contribution to make in mitigating them. Before I start, I want to explain which end of the telescope I am looking through. There are two ways of looking at the relation of Jungian ideas to the public. The first, which I'm going to describe as a push approach, is to say there are all these good Jungian ideas and we will promote them to whoever will listen. I'm not taking that perspective because there are masses of materials that already do that. I'm looking from the other end of the telescope. I'm taking a pull approach by asking, what does the public need to hear from analytical psychology? This embraces the global population, including many people who have no interest in Jung or may even be hostile to him. Also, I'm focusing on what that audience needs to hear, not what they want to hear or naturally focus on, or the ideas that they find most attractive or useful. And I'm also thinking about what happens in this borderland between the two, between what is conscious in analytical psychology, but unconscious in the general public, and how things change when they cross that border. We can see an example of this change in Jung's complaints about how people read his book, Psychological Types. Jung used typology as an example to illustrate a process. But most readers focused on the example and ignored the process. So what has entered the public awareness are things like the critical psychology, the structure of consciousness, the type functions, and the mostly conscious dynamics. What Jung called the gravamen of the book, this stuff on the bottom left, has largely been overlooked. But for many people, it's even worse than that, because even those few messages have been distorted. For some in academia and in the public, type has become a grotesque, unscientific simplification of Barnum descriptions or rigid boxes to put people in, or it's become a dogma. The community of people who use Myers-Briggs typology are in a unique position to rescue Jung's gravamen and help promote it to the wider public, should they see the need and choose to do so. And that essentially is what this presentation is about. So let's start with an Uranus lecture after the Second World War. Jung said, "The possibilities of atomic fission are the surest guarantee that the abomination of desolation will grow to limitless dimensions. And who or what is it that causes all this? It is none other than that harmless and sweetly reasonable human spirit who unfortunately is abysmally unconscious. Man's worst sin is unconsciousness, and in all seriousness, we need to seek ways and means to exorcise him, to rescue him from possession and unconsciousness, and make this the most vital task of civilization." Things have subsequently got worse, not better. In recent decades, politics has been sliding into greater one-sidedness and polarization, to the point where the doomsday clock is now set to 90 seconds to midnight, the closest it has ever been. Jung discussed this emergent threat with Richard Evans in 1957. I'm going to be showing a clip in the live seminar, but I can't, for copyright reasons, include it in the recording. So we will have to skip it, but it's the clip where he says, the world hangs by a thin thread, and I'll quote some more about it later on. There is evidence from astronomy that supports Jung's concern. In the Fermi paradox, the universe is so big that our radio telescopes should be able to detect, the electromagnetic traces of thousands or even millions of advanced civilizations. However, despite extensive searching of the skies, we haven't found any evidence. Frank Drake offered a probable explanation of the paradox. And again, this is another video that I can't include. What Frank Drake does is get a very rare orchid that only flowers for 2 days a year. And he's visited by Brian Cox, and he shows him the orchid flowering. And he says, if you'd been here, 2 days before, might have thought this orchid never flowers. And so it is with SETI and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, that the lifespan of advanced technologies is so short that we never see them. And I've got a graph here that illustrates his argument in a different way. The horizontal axis is time, and the vertical axis is distance from Earth. And these horizontal orange lines demonstrate the lifespan of advanced civilizations. And the yellow dot in the bottom right-hand corner represents the lifespan of mankind. Because it takes time for electromagnetic waves to travel through space, our telescopes can only look along this yellow line. That's because the further away things are, the further back in time we see them. Nevertheless, we should still be able to see, lots of civilizations, or the evidence of lots of civilizations. However, there is very likely some kind of great filter that means civilizations destroy themselves soon after acquiring advanced technology. Every one of these civilizations has a very short lifespan. The line is very short. The great filter is a phenomenon in astronomy that wipes out civilizations before they can encounter each other, explaining the cosmic silence. The great filter has the potential to eradicate life on Earth. A necessary period of introspection is required to mitigate risk to humankind. Jung pointed to a likely part of the great filter, though not using that term, in the interview with Richard Evans that I wasn't able to show. He said nobody would give credit to the idea that the psychical processes of the ordinary man have any importance, and that's the great mistake. He attributed political conflict to the individual psyche because he saw a nation as consisting of the sum of its individuals. Therefore, a political situation is the manifestation of a parallel psychological problem in millions of individuals. The problem is largely unconscious. It consists of a conflict between a conscious standpoint and an unconscious one. Before developing this idea further, I want to acknowledge that there are problems with it. For example, the Jungian analyst and political scientist Lawrence Altshuler writes, in all his political essays, Jung focuses on the role of the individual, either the individual in mass movements or the individual political leader. This is characteristic of naive consciousness. Jung's theory ignores the wider field of social and structural change, political organizations, policies, power structures, and so on. There are many other post-Jungian writers who also recognize the need to broaden Jung's theory. But I'm going to focus on a point Emilia Kiel raises in her foreword to the Jungian book on analysis and activism. She writes, perhaps nothing short of a collective transcendent function could bring about the much-needed peaceful socio-political change. This points to Jung's solution to the type problem, or the problem of conflict, or the problem of opposites. Psychological types, the two essays in Collective Work 7 and the Transcendent Function essay in Collective Works 8, form the core process that is used for individuation, individual therapy, or resolving conflict in society. So in this presentation, I'm going to focus on that process, which not only applies to individual development, but also to collective political, religious, and cultural conflict. There is a good foil to introduce Jung's process in the Encyclopædic of Resolution, which has a model showing how one-sidedness can lead to destruction. At the beginning of a conflict, there is peace, though it can be a negative peace with unrecognized exploitation, denying of rights, social injustice, and so on. The second stage is polarization, where we campaign for a particular group, cause, or set of values. This can be a two-edged sword. Advocacy promotes a legitimate interest, but it can often oversimplify things and drive the polarization to stage 3. Segregation is where things become more hostile between opposing camps. When it escalates further, their focus shifts onto destroying, or at least excluding or disempowering, the opponent. The first two stages of Jung's model or process are very similar. Stage 1 is undifferentiated, and in the second stage, we develop a heroic attitude that advocates for a particular cause. It is at this second stage that we become a type, but we can also become one-sided in our politics and in other attitudes. Like the Encyclopædic, Jung also says this second stage is a two-edged sword. It develops consciousness, but also creates a dangerous split in the psyche. It may not feel dangerous to the individual, but when aggregated across a whole population, that's what causes the political conflicts. A commonly overlooked implication of combining this second stage with Jung's philosophy, which he introduced in chapter 1, is that the split within the psyche creates a corresponding split in external reality. Jung illustrated this with the example of Nietzsche and art in chapter 3, but it applies equally well to politics. For example, if someone identifies with the political left, their lived experience may be that the left-wing politics is progressive, inclusive, and concerned with social justice. Right-wing politics is money-oriented, discriminatory, xenophobic, and so on. For people on the political right, however, their lived experience may be that right-wing politics is concerned with individual motivation, innovation, and entrepreneurship. Left-wing politics is responsible for the cancel culture, the climate of fear, it stifles free speech, and so on. The realities of the two sides are skewed, so they are perpendicular and antagonistic. Jung describes how to overcome this conflict in chapters 2 and 5 of Psychological Types. With the example of typology, John Beebe has summarized the process by writing, "The transcendent function means, among other things, rising to the occasion. Mysteriously enough, this often only happens when the inferior function is engaged to join the superior function, which has to lower itself to receive it." John gives the example of Shakespeare, whose writings were at the time the inferior function of 16th century England, and the encounter with the inferior function led to a transformation of culture. John Beebe also related this to his model in the special edition of the Journal of Analytical Psychology that celebrated 100 years since the publication of Psychological Types. He said that his model is a theory of story, that is, of specific loci of transformation that we travel between when we use various types in the course of our lives. The transcendent function is really a spine of integrity between functions, in which the inferior function turns into the authentic bridge to the unconscious as the eternal player in your life. So John Beebe uses his model not in a static descriptive way, but in a dynamic transformative way that increasingly builds a relationship between consciousness and the unconscious through the spines in his model. In Jung's core process, that transformation takes place in stages 3 and 4, from which a new function or bridge or spine or third thing emerges. But this not only transforms our own psyche, it also transforms the external reality that we experience. When this is applied to politics, it transforms our lived experience of ourselves and our political opponents, and we create a more balanced reality. There doesn't have to be a moral equivalence, and the two sides don't actually have to balance, but we start to experience the positive realities in the other and the negative realities in our own political standpoint. This new experience of reality transforms our worldview and enables us to make better judgments. Now, these two models not only share the first two stages, but the Encyclopædic tacitly points to the Jungian model as the way out of its later stages. For a conflict at these two stages to be resolved, the conflict has to become ripe for resolution, which involves reaching a mutually hurting stalemate. That means both sides have to realize that they can't win. This is quite an important point for Jung's theory, because the transcendent function is not Jung's invention. It's a process that Jung observed can happen naturally. Jung didn't invent it. He invented a method of therapy where analysts could help clients by mediating the transcendent function for them. This graph compares the impact of the two paths. The horizontal axis is time. The vertical axis is damage. The top line shows what happens when polarization escalates through one-sidedness, with lots of casualties and much restorative work needed in the aftermath. The bottom line shows what happens through Jung's path of reconciliation. The shaded area is the cost of one-sidedness. It's the cost of failing to engage with the transcendent function. An example of the bottom path happening naturally is Nelson Mandela's leadership, which overcame apartheid in a transcendent way. Now, in the live seminar, I show some dramatized but accurate film clips, a shortened version of the clips that I showed last year, in which Nelson Mandela develops the transcendent function individually and socially. They're a clear example of the transcendent function in a political context. Mandela developed the transcendent function at an early age because he was brought up in a natural environment. He continued to develop it through into adulthood, and although he couldn't transcend everything, he couldn't transcend the conflict between his work and family, for example, it helped him to transcend racial and political opposites. Jung and von Franz suggested that there are two types of one-sidedness, and Mandela demonstrates the second. He had the flexibility to alternate between one side and the other. Pick them up and put them down like tools is the phrase that von Franz uses. And pay attention to symbols on both sides in order to hold the tension of opposites. So Mandela was able to develop a social transcendent function in South Africa and achieve the lifelong overriding goal of reconciliation or transformation. Mandela's protocol for overcoming racial division is a natural counterpart to Jung's transcendent function that can be used in therapy. Jung had the opportunity to promote his process to a wider audience through UNESCO after the Second World War. He was asked, along with several other people, to make a proposal on how to change global attitudes in a way that was conducive to world peace. However, Jung made, in my view, a mistake in his response. He did not explain how to encourage natural development of the transcendent function, which we just saw exemplified by Nelson Mandela, but he proposed a mass program of psychotherapy based on dream analysis and initially aimed at teachers. UNESCO rejected Jung's proposal and chose something by Anna Freud instead that was more practical. Along with the common misreading of his 1921 book and various other things, this contributed to Jung feeling at the end of his life that he had failed to do enough to save humanity from itself. In 1960, Michael Fordham tried to assure him that Jungians were striving to further recognition of his work. But Jung dismissed those assurances. He was looking from the other end of the telescope. As Shamdasani says, in Jung's own estimation, his theory had failed to make sufficient social impact and hence failed to provide adequate antidotes to the fathers and mothers of all terrors. We can see the limited impact of Jung's theory using some straws in the wind. One straw is Routledge's Introduction to Political Psychology, which has 34 references to Freud and none to Jung. The MBTI is discussed, but mainly as a pale shadow of Big Five theory. Another straw in the wind is Google search numbers. Both Jungian and Freudian topics fare very badly. The most popular Jungian-related topic is the Myers-Briggs type indicator. But the numbers are still small, and it also omits the transcendent function, which is crucial to Jung's process of overcoming the split between consciousness and the unconscious. Science does very well, which isn't luck or coincidence, but the result of 3 centuries of skillful effort by scientists to engage the public in its subject. There are some valuable lessons that we can draw from it. Crossing the border between the public and the scientific domains was established as a discipline in its own right a very long time ago. The essence of the problem for science that this intermediate discipline tries to solve was summarized by Albert Einstein 75 years ago. He wrote, "Anyone presenting a rather abstract scientific subject in a popular manner either succeeds in being intelligible by concealing the core of the problem, or else he gives an expert account that the untrained reader is unable to follow. If these two categories are omitted, surprisingly little remains, but it is not sufficient that each result be applied by a few specialists in the field, because this leads to spiritual poverty." The same could be said of analytical psychology. Now, science started tackling this problem about the borderland between the two 300 years ago, not only through scientific institutions, but also by promoting science in existing schools and universities, and setting up organizations dedicated to the public understanding or promotion of science, including use of things like television. Today, there are many professorships focused purely on the public understanding or public engagement with science. Science has succeeded in getting itself embedded into our culture as a valued way of thinking through a prolonged and intense effort. And the main ways that it crosses the border between expert and public today is by having simple core principles, such as the scientific method of trying to prove yourself wrong. It recognizes how information gets transformed and how the public accommodates it in lots of different ways. It focuses on the two appeals that seem to influence public understanding, which are to make science enchanting or to demonstrate its practical application. And it is still learning lessons, such as reviewing the COVID pandemic and the misunderstandings that occurred that had life and death consequences. This led the researchers to see statistics not as numbers, but as psychosocial actors that exert all sorts of social influences. Again, in the live session, I will be sharing some clips that are from a popular radio show that demonstrate the sophistication that the public engagement of science has reached. Dreams are a fundamental part of Jung's theory. So you might be tempted to think that it's a load of nonsense, but if you want to actually listen to the session, the full session, you can access it via the shortlink myers.co/dreams. The communication is very clever, and the show uses a mix of enchantment and application to engage its audience. However, the way dreams are discussed demonstrates how far analytical psychology is from this public engagement. I'm giving this a very similar presentation to the Journal of Analytical Psychology, attended by many Jungian analysts, and expecting them to cringe at some of the things that are said during the program. Now, I'm not putting any specific proposals on the table at the moment. I'm hoping to start an important debate about the role that users of Myers-Briggs typology can play in introducing the wider public to Jung's core process. And that might help integrate the unconscious, transform our attitudes and culture, and mitigate some of the existential threats to humanity through conflict. It's far beyond one individual or one organization or even one generation, perhaps. Science took 300 years to get where it is today. And there are many challenges. But that's the purpose of the presentation, have a debate. I showed the Journal of Analytical Psychology version of this presentation to John Beebe, and he very kindly gave me some feedback on the first draft. And he also suggested some ideas that could feed into the debate on the types of language we can use to help to cross that border between the two. So with John's permission, I'd like to conclude with some clips from that discussion, which is on Zoom, so therefore not restricted by copyright. Thank you for listening. What do you think are the biggest challenges to promoting engagement with the transcendent function in the wider public?
The biggest obstacle to people accepting the enormous intelligence enhancing potential of the transcendent function is exactly what C.G. Jung thought it was. right up to the time he died and felt he had failed to get across, which is that in addition to a conscious, intelligence has an unconscious. That the unconscious is intelligent, but it must be recognized as a co-equal partner in intelligent action. And the transcendent function is precisely that, which yokes in a positive way, conscious to unconscious, but the same obstacle that Jung faced is that people don't believe there's an unconscious, and there's a kind of stubborn insistence on the Enlightenment.
The question is, how do we tackle that problem of the fact that, by definition, the public as a whole don't accept there's an unconscious, and yet that is the essence of the transcendent function and overcoming some of the deepening conflicts that we can see in wider society.
Well, we'd have to answer that despairing moment when Jung wrote in a letter that I failed in my chief task, which is to convince my contemporaries that man has a soul. I think he made the mistake of putting the problem in religious terms, and I think the term soul hasn't been very helpful, and when it's replaced by spirit, that's more palatable to many moderns or postmoderns. The more I think about it, the more I think about intelligence as a good word. I think the most interesting thing is intelligence. And I think not to value the unconscious, which is a useful term still, is not to understand intelligence and where it emerges. On top of that could come many of the other opposites like rational and irrational. So it seems to me that this is a very useful thing to build community, to make foreign policy more intelligent, to promote dialogue, and very wonderful things. I've seen it make a difference in every organization I've ever been part of, and I've seen the lack of attention to it make the same negative difference. So I'm a true believer in the idea of a transcendent function. What we're trying to transcend, is you put your finger on it in your book, is one-sidedness.
I think what you're doing is saying actually there's got to be a transformation of the information here, that what it's getting at in essence is the same. It's getting at what's unconscious, but we need to find terms like intelligence or maybe unconscious intelligence so that we can actually talk about it in terms that the public can relate to, rather than making it too much of a religious task.
I like the word common because there's a natural tendency of consciousness to kind of gentrify itself. And I love the idea of the common people, the people who are not hiding behind their class and their education and so forth. I also like the word sense. I don't think it has to be reduced to the psychological types terms. But I think the idea of a felt sense, as some were calling it flow, as you know, it's a wonderful state of being that I would call a kind of openness that doesn't eliminate anything the conscious mind has to offer, but doesn't refuse what the unconscious mind has to offer. If we were to say common sense, I'd be quite happy with that. But that's essentially what we don't have when we don't use the transcendent function.
I wonder whether common sense is a powerful enough expression to be able to talk about the unconscious when it's such a strong split in the psyche.
Possibly not. And so I don't want to come up with a formula. Any language is fraught with danger. I do think the deepest wish of people in the world is for the world to come together and solve its problems, because we obviously can. And the only thing standing in our way is the obdurate split between conscious and unconscious. And so we have the answers, but if the politics doesn't support it, and the attitudes of people continue to go in this what I would call obdurate direction, we'll never come together. So common sense is what we have in common, and have a sense that it's still possible to come together.